Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's your man Soul here. Welcome back to the channel, and today we got another tier list. This time brought to you by WoWHead. We have the class PvE tier list for Wrath of the Lich King Classic Phase 1. And I gotta say, after looking at some of the reasonings and looking at the tier list, I'm pretty indifferent on a couple of these things. As we know, the nature of most of anything on the internet that brings some, divisiveness is a tier list. And Wrath is no different. WoW is no different, matter of fact. And like I said, this list raises a few eyebrows in my opinion, especially like if you go into the comment section and you look at some of these things, right? Like people are kind of like, yo, who made this? And at first glance I said the same thing, and then I read a little bit deeper and I could understand some of the reasoning, even though I disagreed with some of the stuff that was said. But I mean, at least they tried to defend their statement and they stood by it, which I respect. But let's jump into it. We're going to dive deep and we're going to figure out if all of this was justified or not. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Alright, so because I'm a tank main, the first thing I look at is the tank tier list. And having Death Knight as the S tier tank of Phase 1 just kind of raises an eyebrow in my opinion. Now, Death Knight is not a bad tank by any means, but I don't know if Death Knight is S tier. But we're gonna click into the deeper description of it, and we're gonna figure it out. So, tank rankings and explanations: Death Knight S tier, Prot, Paladin, Prot Warrior, Inferno Druid all A tier. And let's see what it says. So, Death Knights are strong tanks throughout the entire expansion, from early on Frost off tanking to later Blood main tanking. They're hard to beat in their respective roles. In early phases, you'll see Frost come out as the dominant tanking spec. T7 is a mostly chain pulling mega dungeon, and barely anything hits hard. So he does have a point there, Margarito. He does have a point. Frost tanking is probably the strongest off tanking by virtue of the utility that it brings, right? Because you can do a lot of damage as a Frost off tank, because Frost in and of itself just doesn't require a lot of gear just to put up some decent numbers. So being able to take a hit and still put up some numbers is a really valuable trait. Well, some would see that as a valuable trait, right? And in early phases, he's right. Like in Nax, most Death Knights will be operating as the off tank, because I had mentioned this before, like Death Knights kind of tend to be a little bit squishy early on. Like their damage variance is pretty high early on with low gear levels. So I could see why he would highlight mainly Frost as the dominant tanking spec, because more often than not you're operating as an off tank, and Frost is the best off tank spec for early phases, right? Then he continues to say, this means two things: Willowed Necropolis will be less utilized pretty much for everything but patchwork. Frost has the ability to stack as much avoidance as Blood, and more damage reduction through improved Frost presence. You lose Vampiric Blood and Blood's higher self-sustain for another trade-off. The trade-off is the second thing, damage. Okay, so it's kind of what I mentioned before, but here's the thing. Here's where I think my opinion and Margarito's kind of diverges a little bit, because I don't think he's wrong in saying that, you're trading off damage for a higher sustain. However, dependent on the role you're fulfilling for your raid group as a Death Knight tank will skew your view of this explanation. I'm going to be operating as a main tank. Obviously, as a Frost Death Knight, main tanking isn't the best idea, so that's why I'm going to be Blood. For any fight that I have to off tank, I will have my secondary spec as Frost. Possibly, who knows? Like, more than likely I'm going to have it as Frost with some DPS pieces to swap in and out, right? And that's probably the best way to play Phase 1, right? But does Frost being a high damage off tank put it as S tier? I don't know. I feel like that correlation is what I would probably disagree with, right? This also goes to the power of your raid group. If your raid group is, relatively new to Wrath dungeons, or raids, in my opinion, sorry, they may see having a Blood Death Knight be more valuable than having a Frost Death Knight, right? So I do agree with the sentiment that Frost damage is the best off tank damage. That part I agree with. I do agree with the fact that Nax bosses don't really hit too hard, save for like Patchwork and maybe Thaddeus, right? Like, you're not going to be in too much danger, which means the self-sustain and the power of Will and the Necropolis kind of gets diminished for just a flat increase in passive damage reduction that comes from improved frost presence, because you go from 8% flat DR to 10% flat DR when you're in frost presence. So I get that. I get the value of that. However, I don't know if this alone makes Death Knights the sole only S tier tank. In an ideal guild where you have a prop paladin operating as a main tank and you have a frost DK operating as an off tank, sure. But again, I don't know. I don't know if just having strong off tank damage signifies an S tier tank when you're talking about phase 1. I don't know. And then we have the other 3 tank specs as A tier, right? And I think this was honestly kind of a saving grace, more so for the warrior. I'm not saying warriors are weak. I don't know if they're A tier. I would have given B+. I don't think they're, F tier or trash tier like some of the other earlier predictions for Wrath Classic would have told you. I don't think warrior's like that. I don't think it's unplayable. I've gone on record to say that warrior isn't as bad as what people are making it seem. I've gone on record to say that if you look at all of the tank spot videos, most of them come from a warrior POV. So, even their heroic modes and shit like that in their hard modes. So I don't think warrior is a bad tank. I don't think I would have given it A tier because, like, in my opinion, you can't really compare a warrior, the shortcomings of a warrior, to the shortcomings of a paladin, right? Warrior shortcomings are a lot more evident than a paladin, in my opinion, outside of like speedrunning, and that's kind of what Bianna goes into detail here. Like, warriors will produce the highest main tank DPS of all the tanks because they really do a lot of damage, especially if you're playing the Unrelenting Assault build. Like, warrior just does a lot of damage, like damage shield, Unrelenting Assault, like just natural damage boost that they have. They really do pull a lot of damage. So I'm not going to fault them for that. But does that alone, again, it's like the same damage thing, does damage alone make you A tier, just like does off tank damage alone make you S tier? I don't know. I would have given it, for the encompassing role of a tank, I would have given them a B+ tier, because while their damage is great, amazing, not changing them at all for it, their defensive utility, and that's kind of what you bring a tank for, is lacking compared to the other 2 that's in A tier, right? So it's hard for me to say that I agree with this. I'm not saying that Bianna or any of these guys, Bianna, Nerd Egg, or Margarito or Leopold, like, I'm not saying any of these guys are wrong. I'm not, disparaging their viewpoints, but I don't know if I fully agree with some of their viewpoints either. And warriors in the case where I don't feel like this should have been A tier when you're talking about the encompassing role of a tank. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, like, if you're in a speedrunning guild, yeah, sure, prop warrior is probably going to be the best. Like, their damage, their pull ability, they're going to be the best for pull-to-pull speedrunning, right? For trash clears, right? But not every guild's a speedrunning guild. So if you're not part of the speedrunning guild, you're not part of a high-performing guild, and you go to WoWHead and you look at this, I feel like you're going to get mixed signals, because you're going to think, all right, Death Knight is, for what it is, the S tier tank. And if you may not necessarily read all of this, which you should, like, you shouldn't take anything at face value. You should read into what these guys are explaining, right? But if you're just taking it at face value, you need a quick hit of something. You don't necessarily want to watch a YouTube video. You don't necessarily want to read in depth, all the stuff. And you just see this, and you play a Death Knight, and you find out that a lot of the shortcomings of a Death Knight happens in phase 1 because the item level, the gear levels are lower comparative to what we see later on, and the Death Knight struggles a little bit more. You could be misled. So I don't know. I don't know if I agree with Death Knight being the only S tier tank. I definitely don't think warrior should be an A tier tank in the same vein as a druid or a paladin. And people are going to disagree with me. That's cool. I'm giving my opinion in hopes that I get other people's opinions in return and, get different viewpoints. That's the whole point of this, right? But I don't think putting Death Knight as an S tier tank was the right move. I think Paladin is definitely an S tier tank. Just by nature of, Paladins can still do a lot of damage, and they have great defensive utility and great raid utility. Not any one of these tanks can say that they have the whole package. It's either one or two, and then they lack in one area, right? Paladins kind of have the encompassing role of everything. They have great defensive utility, they have great raid utility, and they have great damage. Now, sure, they're not perfect. They do, slouch in certain areas like snap threat. Like snap threat on a warrior is probably going to be higher than snap threat on a prop paladin, but that's very minor. Like, we can fix snap threat issues. You can't really fix needing a divine sacrifice and not having one, right? So I don't agree with Death Knight being the only S tier. If you're gonna put it in S tier by virtue of just because Frost does the best off tank damage, you got to put Paladin in there too, because it does a lot of damage as well, and it still brings that defensive utility of a main tank. So I don't know. When I look at tank tier list, I think of all encompassing things, not specifics, right? Like, if the Death Knight is the best off tank, to me that doesn't make it an S tier tank. That just doesn't correlate in my opinion. So that's just I can't agree with this. I think the explanations are pretty spot on when it comes to all three of these guys, but I feel like they're very, very, especially when it comes to the Death Knight section, I feel like it's picking one niche and pushing it to S tier, and I don't know if that's correct. So that's all I'll say about the tank one, right? And let's get out of here. Let's go back to the healer one real quick. Let's see what we got. Healer. Okay, so the healer tier list, we have Holy Paladin and Disc Priest in S tier. We have Resto Shaman, Resto Druid in A tier. We have Holy Priest in B tier. And to me, I mean, that seems a little bit more fair. I definitely don't disagree with having the Holy Paladin and the Disc Priest in S tier. Again, Paladin utility is just really, really hard to beat. And when you couple that with a high performing role like a Holy Paladin still does really well. It just creates a culmination of things that are just really hard to stop. Or when you don't have those things, it creates a gap in your power. So I definitely agree with Holy Paladin being S tier. I definitely agree with Disc Priest being in S tier. Disc is the only healer that has, consistent absorbs, consistent damage reduction. This is coupled with, the talent Renewed Hope, where you're reducing the people who you heal or the people who you put power shield on, their damage taken by 3%. Huge for a tank, because their tanks already have, passive DRs. Plus, when they pop cooldowns, they have increased DR. So a Disc Priest just furthering the longevity of a tank is just really, really strong. Plus, they can stop a lot of damage. A Disc Priest who knows the damage patterns of a raid encounter will shine thoroughly, much more so than any other healer in my opinion, because they can pre-bubble before the damage comes out, and dependent on how they manage their weakened soul debuff, they can continually bubble or maybe use divine aegis procs to continue the damage reduction. So it's really, really strong. And for fights like it kind of lists here, a lot of mechanics in phase 1 are also clearly telegraphed, like Malagos Arcane Storm, Kel'Thuzad's Frost Blast. A priest, knowing this is going to happen, can bubble everyone before it even happens. So yeah, I definitely agree with the S tier slots here. As far as the A tier, Resto Shaman and Resto Druid. So I don't necessarily disagree. I would have liked a little bit more deeper explanation from the Resto Shaman side, because I feel like Resto Shaman's kind of got the short end of the stick. Like, if you look at like early on, before we had so much information, before we had beta logs, like if you look at like just like early Shaman information for Wrath Classic, like coming from like War Main or other private servers and stuff like that, Shamans kind of got the short end. Shamans were kind of like the redheaded stepchild of healing. Like, they didn't really get too much shine or light because they didn't really lose a lot of power coming from TBC to Wrath, but they did lose, I would say, a lot of their utility, because a lot of the utility that came from totems kind of got baked into every shaman, right? So when you have that, plus you have the lower scaling of the DPS specs, which we'll get into in a second, it kind of diminishes the power overall of the class, in my opinion. But anyway, putting the Resto Shaman in AT, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think they're really strong. In fact, when I was on War Main, when I played a lot, because I just didn't get into the beta, I mained the Resto Shaman and I felt really powerful. Like, I felt really strong just knowing the damage patterns, knowing when certain things are going to happen, having good reaction time, like those things will really sell a healer, especially. So I don't necessarily disagree with Resto Shaman in A tier. I would have just like see a little bit more detail. That's all. Resto Druid I think is fair in A tier. Resto Druids are really strong. They're they're mana efficient, right? They provide the chill life buff. They provide revitalize. They have really good mobile healing. So I don't think Resto Druid in A tier is a bad thing. Holy Priest being in B tier, the only B tier healer. So I think the Circle of Healing nerf, I feel like it's over exaggerated. So like even here, this person disagrees with me. Whoever wrote this says, Circle of Healing might have been a little over nerfed, going from no cooldown to a 6-second cooldown. In all reality, I don't know if that's an over nerf. It was an instant, very efficient AoE heal. So going from an instant heal that you can just spam whenever you want to having a 6-second cooldown, that doesn't really scream over nerf to me. Now, I'm not a priest main, so I could be looking at things at face value and misjudging it, but like it's like the same vein as Wild Growth, right? No one's calling Wild Growth a bad spell, and it's effectively the same thing. It heals 5 people on a 6-second cooldown and gives them a hot. Now this is a hot, so the healing isn't a one-off, right? The healing is continual. So in fact, the hot lasts 7 seconds to cool down to 6 seconds. So that could be the defining factor when you compare Wild Growth to Circle of Healing. And it might have been an over nerf. Maybe 6 seconds is too much. Maybe 3 seconds would have been more in line with what it needed. But I definitely think Circle of Healing was too strong. It shouldn't have been no cooldown, freeze, 6 people or 5 people healing, right? I think it did need a nerf. Maybe 6 seconds is too long for just an instant one-off, like one not single target, but a heal with no hot component, like Wild Growth. So maybe 3 seconds would have been a little bit better. But I don't think the 6-second heal or the 6-second cooldown is. I don't think that should make it B tier, if that makes sense, right? Because Holy Priest, like they say, Guardian Spirit is nothing spectacular. So Guardian Spirit and Pain Suppression, I feel like Guardian Spirit is the stronger of the tank externals. Pain Suppression is really good. It's a 3-minute CD, reduces the target's damage taken by 40%, right? Really strong, 40%. So that's basically shield wall. But Guardian Spirit increases the healing received by the target by 40% and prevents them from dying. So that prevention of death, to me, automatically is stronger than Pain Suppression. If I cannot die with this buff on me, that's better than hoping I won't die with this buff on me. You know what I mean? So I think Guardian Spirit in and of itself is a stronger cooldown than Pain Suppression. So those two things can be compared to one to another. But again, the person just goes into saying that, this isn't strong enough to justify the nerf to Circle of Healing. And again, I think the 6-second thing just is getting blown out of proportion. Again, this could be my opinion, my one-off opinion about Priest. I haven't played a Holy Priest in quite some time, so maybe I'm misjudging this whole thing. But I have enough WoW experience and I have enough knowledge of making sure to know when damage patterns are happening, making sure to know what spells to cast in certain situations, for me to feel like Circle of Healing, the 6-second cooldown attached to it, I don't know if I would call it an over nerf. It might feel like it because of what we came from, like going from something that's instant, I can cast whenever I want, I can cast on a move, to a 6-second cooldown. I can see the disparity in how you might feel if you play a Holy Priest from TBC going into Wrath, definitely. But calling it an over nerf to me feels like it's an oversight. But that's really it for the healers. I feel like the healers are a little bit more justified than the tanks because there's not really anything inherently wrong here. It's just I feel I have some differences of opinions when it comes to Holy Priest, but I feel like everything else is pretty decent, right? So we can go on back and we can go back to the original post and we can look at the DPS. So DPS, so off rip, we have Warlock, we have Rogue, we have Death Knight as S tier. We have Mage, Enhanced Shaman, and Hunter as A tier. We have Ret, Pharaoh, Boomkin, and Shadow B tier, and then Elemental and Warrior as C tier. So let's go into the DPS tier list a little bit more in depth. And at first glance, the one thing I'll say is this. I don't know if Elemental belongs in C tier, and I don't know if Warrior belongs in C tier. So this is just by virtue of looking at logs from the beta, even though I didn't get a chance to test raids in the beta, so I don't have that hands-on experience. Everything that I'm saying is just by what I've seen in logs, what I've looked at in videos, what I've seen conversations that were happening in Discord. So take what I say with a grain of salt, if you will, right? You can disagree with everything, agree with everything, whatever. But moving on down. So let's see, we got Affliction and we got Support Demo as S tier. And I feel like this is a little bit skewed because I feel like in the latter testing of Wrath Beta, Demonology has been shown to do more damage than Affliction. And the person here, Zafan, says, whilst Demonology doesn't do S tier DPS on single target fights, it holds its own being not being too far behind. And I feel like that's not wrong, but there's also more information you need from that, right? And Affliction, in my opinion, is a spec that lives and dies on fight timers. So if we're having, relatively short fights, right? So 3-4 minute fights, especially like 3-minute fights, I feel like Demo is gonna be better than Affliction, because that's one of the things that was disparaging about the two specs is how much execute time does Affliction have. That's gonna show, the difference in power level between Affliction and Demonology. If Affliction can get off longer drain timings than Demonology can with their meta uptime, Affliction is going to be better. And that part is true in my opinion. But in short fights, which a lot of these fights will probably be short fights, like if you look at, like, let's exclude Eye of Eternity, let's exclude Obsidian Sanctum if we're looking at Nax, right? Nax has what, 14 bosses? Editor Soul will correct this if I'm wrong, but let's just say 14 bosses. Out of those 14 bosses, how many do you think are really gonna be long execute phases, right? How many of the harder fights are you gonna think gonna be long execute phases? Like, we know people are gonna, look at Patchwork. Like, Patchwork is one of the more infamous fights in Nax, right? Looking at Patchwork, like, we can even go to we can even go to like some logs. I think I have one of them bookmarked here. Let's see. I think I have it. I have Zarene's logs. This might just be Saf. Nope. All right, this is the full joint. All right, so this is 10 man. This is 10 man. This is a minute ago. This was July 25th. But we can still kind of get a little bit of an idea, right? 10 man Patchwork, normal. 3 minutes and 34 seconds. 3.5 minutes, right? Look at the damage profiles. All right, so they didn't have a Warlock, so that's kind of a moot point. But we can go back and look at the times, right? And we can see in 10 man, a lot of these fights ain't really long. 2.5 minutes for Anubricon, 2 minutes for Faralina, 2.5 minutes for Maexna, 3.5 minutes for Patchwork, 2.5 for Globulus, a little more than 3.5, almost 4 minutes for Gluth, 5 minutes for Thaddeus. So Thaddeus is a long fight. So Thaddeus, I could see Affliction really rocking. 5 minutes is a long time, especially when you consider the buff, right? 2 minutes for Vesuvius, 5 minutes for Gothic. But Gothic is that fight where you're running back and forth, killing ads and shit. Or not running back and forth, but you have the raid separate. So Gothic's kind of a misnomer. 3 minutes for Horseman. Horseman is another one that could be a long fight, right? But 3 minutes for Horseman. 3.5 for Noth. It took them longer to kill Noth than it did to kill Horseman, right? 3 minutes for Huygen. 4.5. So Lotheb is another one where Affliction I could see reign supreme, right? I should probably hit full screen, but whatever. Y'all get the gist. Saffron 4 minutes. Kel'Thuzad 5 minutes. So here we have really, so if we count it, we have anything that's like 4 minutes and up. So KT, I'll include Saffron in there. So we got KT, Saf, Lotheb, Gothic, Thaddeus. So what? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I was one boss off. 15 fights. So yeah, I don't know if that correlates into Affliction just being S tier, because like I said, I think it's a spec that lives and dies on its execute times. But when you have only a handful of fights that you might see long execute times, and 2 of them are, you know, buff related. You have Lotheb, you have Thaddeus that, you know, give you buffs, and that buff is going to be on the demo lock too. So I don't know if only calling it S tier because of support is right, in my opinion. So that's something that I'm a little skewed on when it comes to only calling Affliction S tier for its damage, but then calling Demo S tier only for its support and A tier DPS. I don't know. I think if you look at some of the later logs, like if you want to go to like Pre-Fox, he did a lot of beta testing on different specs, and he always posts his logs. You'll see a lot of damage dealers doing pretty well, and I might pull one up. This video is already kind of long. I didn't want to drag it, but I'm trying to get as much detail and as much concise thoughts out as I can. So we're gonna keep moving, but yeah. So in Destruction C tier, I also think that's unfair for Destruction. I don't think Destruction's C tier because you're putting it in the same tier as Elemental and as both the Warrior specs. And I don't know if Destruction is that bad, to be quite honest. So he says Destruction doesn't have the highest DPS, but it does provide solid forms of support and uniquely a lot of ad management, which is true. And I would like I guess if this ever reaches, you know, Zafan's eyes, my question would be, what range are we considering S tier damage versus C tier damage, right? Because you know what, fuck it, I'll look it up because I want to try to be as clear as we can here. So like let's go to Pre-Fox, right? Pre-Fox, and we can go to his channel. We can see a lot of testing that he did. Beta Arms War 3 weeks ago. All right, I'm sure he posted logs here. Here we go. Classic logs. I'm pretty sure that was 25 man, right? Yep, 25 man arms. I had to check that real quick. Boom. All right, so even at 25 man, we can look at some of these kill times, right? 25 man, not even 3 minutes on Patchwork. 5 minutes is still for Gothic. 2.5 for Horseman. Almost not even 2 minutes for my Exna. 1.5 minutes, a little bit higher for Fair. So yeah, we can see these kill times, and this already tells me. Let's assume that Nax releases in whatever state it was in for this run that Pre-Fox did, right? We can already see that these kill times are not high at all. Like that, we have the outliers. We have Gothic, which, like I said, I think is an asterisk just because of the nature of the fight. We had a 7-minute kill time on Kel'Thuzad, which I don't think is right. That might have been something different. I don't know. I don't know if they had to rebuild their group. I don't know what happened there, but I don't know. That's not the norm. That's the exception to the rule, not the standard. So I'm not gonna look at that one. But 3 minutes for Saffron, a little more than 3.5, almost 4 for Lotheb. 2:46 for Hygen, 3 minutes for Noth. Like, yeah, these aren't long fights. So these are the kind of timings that is going to favor Demonology. Because like people forget, like Demonology has an execute 2. Decimation is nothing to cough at. Like Demonology does have an execute 2, and if they line it up with their meta timings, but I mean a lot of these fights, like you're only getting 1 meta with this. 2 minutes, you're only getting 1 meta. You're only getting 1 meta for Vesuvius, 1 for Patchwork, 1 for Globulus. So a lot of these fights you're only getting 1 meta, but honestly that's probably all you really need. So depending on how you're managing your meta, like if you're heroing off the bat and you're metaing off the bat, you're going to see a lot high numbers up front. If you're saving meta for execute, your execute's going to be strong. Don't know if that's the right way to go about doing things. I'm just giving you different scenarios. But like we can look at Patchwork real quick. Let's look at the damage profile. So they had 1 Demonology lock, and let's look at it. So 2 minutes and 51 seconds damage profile. Boom. And lo and behold, we have the Demo lock beating the Affliction locks. Now, skill does take into effect, but these guys are pretty close. These guys are pretty close. This guy even had less item level, 199 to 203, so he had something, he had a little bit less than his affliction counterpart, right? And then Pure Shadow had 203 as well. He had higher item level. Yeah, so both of these guys had higher item levels than Rigo. Now, this could be a number of things. Like, I don't know if this person's dual wielding versus, you know, staff holders. Who knows? I'm not going to get too deep into item level. It's literally like a 4-point difference, so it's not that drastic anyway. But yeah, like on kill times where it's like 2.5, 3 minutes, homie got a meta out, and look at his, you know, Soulfire. That's his execute. That's decimation. So yeah, I don't know if I say affliction's S tier strictly because of damage and not put Demo in S tier strictly because of damage, right? Because it's not doing bad damage. So let me try to get rid of this ad. But yeah, so I don't know. But I'm dragging the Warlock thing. I want to look at the other ones real quick. Sorry, that was a very long tangent on it. And like I said, last thing, I don't think Destruction deserves C. Might be B, but I would have to do more research to firmly cement that. But we're gonna keep moving. So Rogue, we got Assassination S tier, we got Combat S tier, we got Subtlety B tier. I think B tier is very generous for Subtlety. If you're gonna give Destruction C, I feel like you should have gave Subtlety C too. But again, to firmly cement my stance on Subtlety being C tier, I would want to do more research into Subtlety damage, and that requires a lot of effort for Subtlety that I'm not willing to give. Sorry. But Assassination and Combat being S tier, I think this is another case of how long does the fight last? Longer fights, I mean, I feel like for Combat to become S tier above Assassination, the fight has to be really, really short, like kind of like what we saw with Patchwork. So like there's no Combat Rookie. I think all these guys are Assassination, looking at the icon here. But I feel like on this fight, because the Combat Rogue has cooldowns and Assassination doesn't, and I don't know like who they're tricksing, like if they're tricksing each other or whatever the case may be. I don't know how that's going on, but in this instance, I would say probably the Combat Rogue is beating some of these Assassination Rogues. Like he's probably going to be in the top 5 somewhere. He might be Moon LOL. Take a Stab seems like he's a really, really good Assassination Rogue, so I don't know if he's beating this person. And again, this is just one log. Like I'm not trying to live and die off of one log, just using it as kind of like an example, a little bit of a measuring stick. But again, Assassination versus Combat is kind of the same thing as Affliction versus Demo. I feel like a lot of those things are determined by the length of the fight. And for Combat, or for Rogue in general, I feel like it's who you're tricksing. Subtlety being B tier, I'm on the fence about. I don't know about that one. Moving on down, we have the Death Knights. All 3 specs are viable. So it's weird that they didn't give letters to the Death Knight DPS specs. Even though they kind of already put it in S tier, which I think is okay. I'd probably say Frost is the S tier one for phase 1 and Unholy's the A tier one for phase 1, but the damage profiles are so close that I can understand putting them both in S tier. I'm not mad at that. Blood, saying that it's in a bit of a situation. Blood is just bad. Blood is just not good damage when you're comparing it to Frost and Unholy. It's not even close. Like Blood is just a bad damage spec compared to the other two. And if I had to give a number on it, I say C tier for Blood. Like Blood to me is an example of a C tier DPS spec. Moving on down, we have the Mage. So Arcane Mage, I think they put this in A tier, right? Let me scroll up right quick. Mage is in A tier. So in fact, you know what I'm going to do so I don't have to keep scrolling because that's pretty annoying. We're going to duplicate this. We're going to move this over to my second screen so I don't have to keep scrolling and I can just reference the tier list because it's looking like not each writer, they didn't put a letter to each respective spec. So I'm just going to, so instead of scrolling up and down, I can just look at it. But anyway, so Arcane we have as, they don't have a tier for it, but they just put Mage in general as A tier. If I had to give letters for it, I think Arcane is safely in A tier. Fire. So again, with these pure DPS specs, like if you're looking at fight length and fight knowledge, you know, it's saying Fire doesn't perform well on short fights, but on longer fights because of Molten Fury execution, it becomes better. And that could be true. I'm not the best mage person out there, right? However, when I'm looking at tier lists, I'm looking at overall encompassing things, and I feel like fire doesn't have what it needs to be called an A tier spec in phase 1. I could be dead ass wrong, but stat wise, I feel like it doesn't have what it needs to be an A tier. Fire might be like, if I'm really like putting a letter to it, C plus B minus. C plus for the generic fire mage, B minus for someone who knows what they're doing. I don't think it's fair to put fire, not saying that this person did, but the assumption, like if a person is just looking at this A tier specs and they see mage, they're gonna assume that this means 2 out of the 3 specs at the very least, like if, you know, before reading it. So if I had to put a letter to it, I would say Arcane and Mage is safe in A tier. Like I said, Fire, C plus, B minus. And Frost is in that same area as Subtlety. Yeah, I don't think Frost, I think Frost is C, D plus, C minus, DPS. But because of the nature of the short fights, like this guy's even saying it, phase 1 fights almost seem to be made for Arcane due to burst damage and short fights. They provide okay but not amazing buffs. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, because of the nature of phase 1, I don't know if it's fair to not put a letter to these. Like, I think it should be A, C plus, B minus, and then D plus, C minus for Frost. Enhancement, very short explanation, which is sad. I would have liked to see a little bit more in depth talk about enhancement, because I feel like this is one of the unsung specs that people want more information on, but have to really dig to find it. But anyway, enhance are in an odd position for phase 1, being a decent spec that doesn't require a lot of armor penetration to really take off, but also being one of the hardest specs to perform. It's pretty accurate. Enhance can also play spell hands, essentially playing enhancement but gearing for spell power instead of melee damage. This also scales abilities like Fire Nova and Chain Lightning to boost your AoE significantly. Either playstyle can work in phase 1, but a bad player will be distinctly noticeable. I feel like that's kind of the same for any class, right? Like that statement can be, like, he's not wrong in saying it, but I feel like you can discern a bad player from a good player pretty evidently in any class. Some are more evident than others, and I think enhance is one of those things, like what he's trying to say. But like, I think the statement is a blanket statement for most specs. But yeah, see, there's not much information here, and he put enhance in, or not he, but WoWHead, whoever, you know, their combination of, you know, staff writers and guide writers, they decided to put enhance in A tier. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I just think they don't really justify, they don't really give an explanation on why it's an A tier, and I don't really like that. I don't know if they just couldn't find a writer for enhancement, and that's why they don't have like the name, like you see how Hunter has Ramos here. Maybe they just didn't have a guide writer or someone to like confidently write about enhance, both traditional and spell hands. So that could have been it, but I don't like putting it blindly in A tier with no explanation. I do think it does belong in A tier, especially from what I've seen, like the damage dealings that I've seen, especially coming from spell hands, right? But I would have liked more explanation on it. Maybe I'll do a video on it. I don't know. I'm not really the one to talk about shaman like that, but I could do the research and figure it out. But like, let me just see if we can just judge real quick. So this group didn't have an enhanced shaman, so I can't really show it. But yeah, I don't think it's wrong being A tier. I think they should have provided more reasoning as to why. Hunter. So Veramos, he's a pretty much well-known hunter. People know Veramos. He put Hunter in A tier, and he mentions that survival and marksman are pretty close in damage output. Survival did receive nerfs in the 3.3.5 patch, so it's no longer the default spec to play in phase 1. I know a lot of speculation, even I think I've said before that because marksman is really reliant on armor penetration and survival isn't, it was just assumed that survival was just going to be better, but that was not taking into effect the nerfs that came about to survival in 3.3.5. And like he said before, like you can look and see that marksman is performing just as good, if not better, on some pulls than survival is. So I think this is spot on. Hunter is pretty much an A tier class. And for BM, he says it potentially has good damage output. They won't be the best. They can be competitive and pull some great numbers in short fights, which is mostly the case in Nax. But it does have some notable things like not BM, but Bistro Wrath being cut to 10 seconds from 18, which is a really big drop off. Like having a buff for 10 seconds versus having it for 18, that's almost double the time. So that's a really big cutoff. I wouldn't put BM in A tier. I would definitely put survival and marksman. So I think that's safe. So B tier, we have Ret, we have Feral Druid, we have Balanced Druid, and I feel like this is unfair for Balance. I think Balance should be, like, if you're gonna put it in B tier, I would at least give it B plus, A minus. I think Balance is a very solid spec, and I don't think it gets enough praise. And I think that's even more culminated in a skilled player, someone who really understands the damage profiles of the fight and understands the mechanics of balance in and of itself. So I don't think it's fair to loop it in with the other B tier specs. Like, you see how Nerdegg gave a B plus to Feral. I wish like a lot of the other guide writers would have did that, but that's the only thing I'll say about B tier. I think the other ones, I think these are pretty spot on. I think Ret is safely in B. Feral safety in B plus. Balance I think is B plus too. B plus, A minus. I would even give it A minus because it still does really good single target, but it does immaculate AoE damage. So I would have even given it A tier, to be honest. Shadow Priest, I think B is safe for Shadow Priest. I think B is safe for Shadow Priest because it got a lot of changes and a lot of buffs from TBC. So those things really helped its scaling issue. So I think while it doesn't do as much AoE as a Boomkin necessarily, I think it's still decent. I think B tier is safe. And then we go on to C tier. Sorry, I'm kind of moving fast. Like I said, this is a long video. I didn't want it to be super long, but this is a longer video, so I want to make sure I get as much information as I can out. But we're looking at C tier. I think this is unfair. So with Elemental, I think it's pretty much known that Elemental is really strong in phase 1. It doesn't require a lot of gear. It has a lot of different modifiers in its innate kit that boost it up. It does drop off quite a bit, but putting it in C tier in phase 1, I don't think is the right move. I think Elemental does an incredible amount of damage in phase 1 because while everyone is chasing item level, Elemental doesn't really have to chase it that much because it has a lot of things going for it. Now, this person says elemental damage is lackluster compared to pure DPS classes, and we no longer offer much in the way of unique support buffs instead of having every buff we offer provided by someone else. That part is true. The only thing is, I don't know if I call it lackluster compared to pure DPS in phase 1. Again, taking with a grain of salt because again, this is just one log. But if we look at this Patrick kill, we can clearly see that the Elemental Shaman isn't bottom of the barrel, right? And we can also see, like, more specifically, these guys have pretty much similar activity times, right? So, like, the highest being 99, and he was active the whole time, and that's the tank. Let's see, DPS. So, yeah. So, these activity times don't drop off. Like, the variance between the highest and the lowest is about 9%, but I'm pretty sure this person died. And this person definitely died. But we can see that for the most part, for most of the DPS, the activity times remain pretty much the same, or very close, I'll say. So yeah, I don't know if I agree. Like, he's doing 5.4. The Unholy DK, who was considered S tier, doing 5.4. The Affliction Lock is doing 5.4. The Demo Lock is doing 5.4. So it's like, to say these three are S tier, but this guy is C tier. You know what I mean? Like, that seems kind of, kind of skewed in my opinion. Even looking at the other C tier ones. So we have Fury and we have Arms. So Fury probably deserves to be C tier. If I had to put an exact grade on it, it'd probably be like C plus. I don't know if it gets to B tier though. But, and that's that, and C plus is like a skilled Fury warrior. I don't think Fury is just where, I don't think it's where it wants to be at for, when you compare it to a higher damage dealer, right? So, but Arms, I don't know. Arms, I might give it the B nod because, again, comparatively speaking, this person did 5K, almost 5.1. This person did 5.3. Enhance is considered A, Arms is considered C, right? So it's like, I don't know what people are considering a tier DPS number versus a C tier DPS number, but I feel like, and again, these are these are different players, different skill sets, right? But I feel like most of their skill sets we can see are kind of this, like, similar. So again, to call like Pre-Fox on an Arms Warrior C tier, but then the very next person A tier is kind of weird. And same thing with, you know, Elemental, calling Elemental C tier, but then calling Unholy, Affliction, Demo S tier, or like their damage numbers for the most part are very, very, very similar. So that's why I think it's unfair to Elemental. Fury, I think, is C tier. It's unfortunate. I want it to be higher, but Fury, I think, is C tier. Arms, I think, can get the B nod, but that's really it for the DPS. There is no D tier, there is no F tier. And as far as the whole like tier list in general, like when I know I'm scrolling and I said I wouldn't, but my bad. As far as looking at the whole thing in general, like the culmination of each role, I definitely disagree with Death Knight being the only S tier tank. If you even want to make it S tier, I don't know if I consider Death Knight S tier in phase 1. Definitely A tier. I don't know if I consider it S tier. And in that same vein, if we're gonna call Paladin A tier, by virtue, I don't think these two are A tier as well, because they don't provide the same things that a Paladin does. Now, I know we talked about speedrunning, we talked about different raiding environments, so you have to use those things, but I don't know if I put these guys all in the same lineup, right? Healers, I think, is pretty safe. I think it might have been a little over exaggerated with the Circle of Healing nerf, but actual Holy Priest might feel different coming from TBC to Rats, and I won't disparage their opinion, right? So, but I think for the most part, the healer tier list is pretty good, and the DPS tier list overall is okay. I would have loved more explanation as to why they think Enhance is A tier, without just random statements about it. I think Boomkin should have been A tier. Feral is in a weird spot because Feral, if you would have looked, a couple months ago, Feral was in S tier in damn near every person's tier list. So seeing it be B tier or B plus, I think is what NerdEgg gave it. B plus is fair. I think Feral, much like Enhance, is a DPS spec that wildly scales dependent on the player's skill, right? So B plus for maybe the average or maybe slightly above average player, probably A plus to a really skilled Feral Druid. And I wish that sentiment would have been expressed. It might have been. I didn't really read all of NerdEgg's explanation on it, so he might have said I'm going off the back of what I've seen from the other explanations. And as far as C tier, I think Elemental Shaman kind of got the short end there. I think Fury definitely belongs in C tier. Arms, maybe. But then again, if it's not a definite, doesn't need to be in C tier, then it probably should be in C tier. So Warrior, they might have right. Elemental, I feel like because it's so strong and doesn't need much in phase 1, I feel like it could have easily been in B tier. But that's my opinions about the WoWHead tier list. I think this is an interesting read. I think the comment section is going to be an interesting read, and I really want to know what you guys think. So if you made it this long, I appreciate you watching the whole video. And if you like what you see, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps the channel a lot as we grow to 1K. Other than that, you know what it is. Y'all been great. I've been Soul, and I'm out. Peace.